and I decided to do it on a song called Fear by Kendrick Lamar. So a little bit of background. Kendrick Lamar is a rapper from Compton, California. He's known for having socially conscious songs and messages, and Fear is from his critically acclaimed album Damn, which won a bunch of awards including Grammys and even a Pulitzer Prize. So the matwa, or the meaning of the work as a whole, from Fear is that fear can take a vice-like grip on people's lives and can affect anyone of any age or any status. Now I know that we're technically supposed to recite the poem, but unfortunately Fear is an 8-minute long song, so if I did recite it, it would take up most of the presentation. So I'm deciding not to recite it. So the first thing that we'll start with is the impact of Kendrick's fears. The first part of the matwa, which is like how it can take control of how it takes control of Kendrick's life. And Kendrick shows this through repetition and organization. So as you can see from these two passages here, Kendrick uses repetition in multiple parts of the song. The first part on the left, which is highlighted in red, he repeats the phrase "I beat your ass," and in the second part he highlights he repeats "I'll probably die." And so this not only highlights what his fear is, but it also highlights the extent with which he thinks about it, right? So having it show up repeatedly in the poem makes it seem like it showed up consistently in his life, and he couldn't shake that from his head. Then organization. So the way that this song is set up is it talks about his fear as a 7-year-old, and then it goes to another stanza, or I guess verse, and it talks about his fears as a 17-year-old, and then finally it goes to the third verse and it talks about his fears as a 27-year-old. So what that does is it shows the elongated period with which Kendrick has these fears, and it shows that it can follow him for decades. It's followed him for decades. And so Kendrick, shows his fear at every single level. And another thing that it does is it shows that how his fears have changed and developed. And even though, they've changed, they've only strengthened and gotten worse. So the next part of the matwa, the second part, is Kendrick talks about how fear can affect just about anybody. So he does this through loss of repetition and relatability. So in the first two verses, when Kendrick was 7 years old and 17 years old, he shows his fear through repetition. But when he's 27 years old, he doesn't use repetition. On the left, he shows how his fears have become varied and different, and yet at the same time, they're just as overwhelming as ever. So he kind of uses half and half, where in the blue he does repeat that he's scared, he has fear, and on the right he talks about what the specific fear is, and he shows about 6 different fears, and he still uses repetition to show that it's still weighing heavy on his conscience, but he also shows that they're different. These fears are different now, and they're more varied, which can make it even more overwhelming. And then on the right, he shows that he mentions his fear and then talks about the individual specifics of that fear. So he'll talk about losing it all, and then he goes into depth about not being scared to spend money and making a lot, but still not willing to, you know, buy him a car or something like that. So yeah, so as Kendrick gets older, his fears become less straightforward and more varied, and the complexity and variation, um, through the loss of repetition, it's contrasting to the first few sections, the first two verses when he was 7 and 17. This can make it more overwhelming, and yeah, and so it shows that even though Kendrick is now rich and famous, it doesn't make him above, you know, above everyone else in terms of having fears. He's still just as scared as ever. It's just what he's scared of is different. So last thing is relatability. So of course, you know, a lot of the stories that Kendrick tells, honestly, I couldn't even imagine going through them. But then he'll also have, you know, lines which are highlighted in purple, of lines that like just anybody would go through, and like the overall theme of fear itself is very relatable in this song. Like everybody has to go through fear, and so in that way everyone can connect with him. But the individual specifics, which are highlighted in yellow, are almost like unimaginable, and like personally I've never gone through any of that. So it's kind of a weird balance that he makes with relatability and telling this crazy story. And on the right, he this is a chorus on the right, and it's relatable to some in terms of like ways that people cope with their fears and deal with their fears is unfortunately through drugs and stuff. So yeah, he finds that balance where he's very relatable, and yet he still tells this crazy story. And so this allows for people to connect with him, and this shows that, you know, Kendrick, these larger than life people like Kendrick Lamar goes through very similar things that we do. And so I think overall, this is something that makes Kendrick stand out to me as an artist, is through this connectability, Kendrick allows for people to empathize with them rather than sympathize, which is very different, because it's kind of the difference between, you know, just feeling sorry for someone and connecting with them, like, oh, I feel you, rather than, oh, I feel sorry for you. And so that creates a completely different dynamic when you're listening to his music. It is like you can connect with, oh yeah, I felt fear before. It's just I've never walked around being scared for my life. It's kind of like it's like this balance that he creates, where it's like you can connect with them, but at the same time you can never fully imagine what he went through. And so yeah, that's something that Kendrick does on a lot of songs, and this is one of probably his most prominent examples of that. That's kind of it, actually. So yeah, anyways, that was Fear, and